Can everybody see my screen and hear me okay? Yep, okay, great. So thank you so much for inviting me to present at this symposium. I think it's so great when we can sort of extend our reach beyond the usual suspects. So I'm really happy that, you know, you've coordinated with all of these different time zones in mind. It's really nice to open up and make it more international, even though we're all isolated at the moment. So I'm going to present some work that we've been conducting over the last few years in the Frontier Research Group at the University of Sydney, exploring semantic contributions to event construction. And I'm hoping that by the end of this talk, I will have convinced you that semantic memory does play actually a foundational role in supporting what we would typically view as being episodic functions. So I've always been interested in episodic memory, and we know that this is our sort of, personal timeline. If we think about our autobiographical memories, they're these events that sort of punctuate our selfhood. They define who we are. They're usually embedded within a very specific spatio-temporal context. They contain many sensory perceptual elements, emotional connotations, and usually have some sense of, personal relevance and salience for who we are as individuals. In contrast, episodic memory is often held up against, the other side of the coin, which is semantic memory. And this is proposed to be our repository of world knowledge, typically devoid of a particular spatial context or temporal context. So we can't quite remember when or where we acquired this information, but we know that we have it. And we carry around this vast repository that we can sort of roll out and use across different scenarios. So this is how the original conception by Tulving would sort of pan out. But as we know now with the advent of neuroimaging, there's considerably more overlap between the two sort of neural systems that support episodic memory and semantic memory than we've ever really previously appreciated. And so it seems that actually they overlap far more than they actually dissociate. So these are just two representative examples from the work of Mick Rugg's lab and from Jeffrey Binder's lab, which show that there's considerable overlap. Interestingly, I think for the purposes of this talk, one of the key regions that seems to overlap quite considerably is that of the angular gyrus. And I'm going to come back to that later on because I think this is an important structure that we need to actually understand more about. So over the last 10 years or so, I've been exploring how episodic memory and semantic memory actually degrade in certain neurodegenerative conditions. And so the classic or sort of archetypal, lesion model for episodic memory in dementias would be that of Alzheimer's disease, which is here on the left. And so patients will typically present to the clinic expressing that they're no longer able to, make new memories. So recent memory, episodic memory is predominantly affected. And people will lose track of conversations, they might misplace belongings, there's a disorientation to time and place. Remote memory though, so memories that are further back from the past, seem to be relatively better preserved in Alzheimer's disease. And we know that the atrophy in this particular patient group seems to target that core memory network, which is anchored on the medial temporal lobes, but also includes midline, prefrontal and posterior parietal regions. So this default network or core memory network. But then in contrast, we have this really remarkable group called semantic dementia. And as the name suggests, semantic dementia is basically the focal and circumscribed loss of semantic or general conceptual knowledge. And so these patients are truly fascinating in that it's very, very distinct amodal or panmodal loss of conceptual knowledge in the context of a relative sparing of visuospatial and episodic memory. So if you can look at the two quotes here, we can see that we have an Alzheimer's patient. Both of these patients were tested on the autobiographical interview. And for recent memory, the Alzheimer patient here in green expressed that they didn't know what they did within the last year. They didn't think they did anything exciting. You don't tend to do anything exciting at my age. So they're sort of qualifying why they don't have a recent episodic memory to elaborate on. But what's really interesting, I think, from the semantic dementia patient is that they can give you a recent autobiographical and episodic event. So the patient tells me, last weekend, we went out to eat with the family. We had a special bread with a special sauce, but it was sweet. So there's a few things to note here. They're giving us the context, the temporal context. They were able to give me a spatial location for this event. They told me who was there, what happened, what transpired. But you'll notice that this account or this narrative is punctuated by marked anomia. So they're telling me about this special bread. There's sort of a circumlocuitous way of describing something. And in fact, what this patient was describing was eating pancakes. So the construct is gradually getting eroded, and they lose the ability to name and to elaborate on these constructs. And so we've conducted a number of studies now where we've explored how different types of memory are affected in Alzheimer's disease relative to semantic dementia. And what's interesting, first of all, is that using nonverbal indices of episodic retrieval, we actually show that semantic dementia patients, despite profound semantic impairments and anterior temporal lobe atrophy, show relatively spared or intact visuospatial or visuoconstructive memory. So this is on the Ray complex figure, whereas Alzheimer patients are obviously remarkably impaired. And then in terms of recent autobiographical memory retrieval, we and others, in independent studies have shown that recent memory, in fact, is largely intact in this patient group, whereas remote memory is impaired. So there's something about these more perceptually rich and more recent memories that seem to be spared this sort of semantic onslaught that occurs in semantic dementia. But for me, the big question really that I've been pursuing over the last few years is, how does this sort of translate and enable us to understand some of the component processes that are driving our ability to imagine future events? And as I'm sure all of you are aware, we know that work that was pioneered by Donna Rose Addis and Dan Schachter has shown that the ability to envisage events that have not yet occurred in the future depends heavily upon the integrity of the episodic memory system. So when we try to envisage an event that we have not yet experienced, what happens is we extract out episodic or contextual details from past episodes, and then we flexibly recombine them into novel configurations. And this sort of bestows an immense flexibility in terms of our cognitive prowess, in that we don't have to experience every event, under the sun. We can actually go back in through our episodic store and shuffle them around and then create new simulations or experiences to sort of hypothetically test out novel scenarios. By the same view, damage or changes to the episodic memory system should then compromise your ability to envisage the future. And this is exactly what is shown across a range of clinical disorders, including mild cognitive impairment, depression, and Alzheimer's disease, where changes in the efficacy or integrity of the episodic memory store sort of compromise the ability then to simulate specific and contextually rich events in the future. We didn't know what semantic memory was doing in all of this, as the literature had really been sort of loaded or focused on the episodic contributions. And so in a study in collaboration with Donna Rose Addis, we explored the capacity for past and future simulation in semantic dementia versus a sort of disease control group of Alzheimer's disease patients. And so we again showed that recent episodic recalls, so remembering events from within 1 year, was relatively intact in semantic dementia, whereas the Alzheimer patients were, of course, as you would expect, compromised and generated impoverished sort of narratives. But for the future condition, we were quite surprised to see that, in fact, our semantic dementia patients were as impaired as the disease control group of Alzheimer's disease. And so this suggests that despite having a store of episodic experiences with which they could potentially leverage to envisage future events, this isn't sufficient. And so there's a sort of asymmetric profile here whereby past memory is occurring relatively spared in the context of markedly impaired future thinking. And this would suggest that semantic memory is the candidate mechanism that's, gone awry here. But we wanted to show this definitively. So we explored the neural substrates using structural voxel-based morphometry imaging. And so we found that the atrophy or the gray matter intensity decrease in predominantly left inferior temporal and right temporal polar regions was driving this future thinking impairment in the semantic dementia group. And then the lack of detail or the performance on our measure of future thinking correlated with an independent measure of semantic processing. a neuropsychological test that we also administered. So this suggests that on the behavioral and on the neural level, something about the compromised semantic processing system is related to the deficits that we're seeing in episodic future thinking in semantic dementia. And what was really nice was that we showed that, in fact, there were different mechanisms at play in the Alzheimer group. So we showed that there were more of these sort of candidate regions within the medial temporal lobes, posterior cingulate and frontal pole, which would dovetail more with an episodic mechanism. And that, in fact, played out on the behavioral level because we found correlations with the level of detail of future events in the Alzheimer group and then an independent standard test of episodic memory. So it suggests that we can have comparable behavioral overall performance with these two different groups, but it's being driven by different or divergent underlying neural and cognitive mechanisms. And one of the things that was really interesting for me was looking at the transcripts. So this is where you need to really get to understand your data. And it seemed that many of the semantic dementia patients, even when they did generate an event, were heavily relying and drawing on their episodic memory that remained intact to them. So here's an example. So one of the patients is describing that he's going to go and have a meal with some of his friends, and then he takes us back to the past. So he tells me all about the last time that they did this dinner out with the same group of friends, where they went, the type of food that they had, popular food that's happening in Sydney at the moment. And then he said, but this time, I think we'll go Middle Eastern. So it's like taking the entire event and sort of transplanting it into the future context without, being able to chop it up or make something novel from the simulation. So what we propose then is that semantic memory is providing some, form of scaffolding that actually helps to imbue this event or this simulation with novelty. And so in the absence of this semantic scaffold, what our semantic dementia patients seem to be doing is just sampling entire episodic events and transplanting them or recapitulating them across into the future context. And this gives rise to this idea of what we started to term recasting. So the event novelty is heavily compromised, and because episodic memory is the main sort of route to which, or the most accessible form of detail that these patients have, we see them recasting into the future context. And so this is sort of the basis of the semantic scaffolding hypothesis that we proposed, and something that I'll sort of revert back to as we go through some of the newer work that I'm going to present here. So one thing that's important to note about these studies is that most of them have taken place within a relatively sort of truncated temporal timeline. So the majority of studies have explored past and future thinking with events that occur within 1 year previously and 1 year looking ahead in time. And there have been a number of other studies that are shown here on the slides where they've started to push the temporal boundaries and ask people to think of events maybe 5 years into the past or 5 years into the future. And it's been demonstrated that the quality, the level of detail, and the semantic sort of nature of these events in healthy young individuals, at least, it seems to be much more driven by semantic processing. And this makes sense because I think the further that we move away from the present moment in time, the less experience that we have, particularly when we go into the far future. There's an element of psychological distance, and that we start to need to almost grapple and pull upon schemas or scripts of what usually happens, what typically happens, because we don't really have the personal episodic experience to populate these events. So in the context of this current study, this is what we sought to explore. It was how does pushing out these temporal boundaries influence the semantic content of our future simulations? And so here are the findings. So we're looking at the recent past, which is remembering an event within the previous year. And then our semantic dementia patients are in yellow here. And so it's really interesting from a number of perspectives, I think, that we show again that recent episodic memory remains relatively intact. And so this is a new population of semantic dementia patients, so independent from our previous study. But what was really fascinating for me was I had assumed that perhaps far future, so this is going 10 years into the future, would be most impacted in semantic dementia. But really, we found no significant difference across any of the other contexts once you moved away from the present moment. or the recent past. And so it seems that even if you're recalling events 10 years ago into the past, you're simulating an event 1 year into the future or 10 years into the future, the semantic dementia patients are struggling at a sort of comparable level across all of these temporal contexts. So that either says to us that semantic memory is more important when you shift away from recent experiences, or maybe there's something about this recent time period that we need to understand better as well. And maybe that's being driven by more perceptual contributions. It's something that we're still not sure about, but we're getting some insights from looking again at the voxel-based morphometry results. So what we found was that the near future event, so again, this is looking just 1 year into the future, correlated robustly with, again, bilateral temporal lobe and gray matter intensity, bilateral hippocampal. But when we looked at the far future condition, this actually demonstrated additional associations with the angular gyrus and more posterior temporo-occipital cortices. So this is why I mentioned the angular gyrus. This seems to be a region of immense convergence in terms of episodic and semantic sort of integration. And I'm wondering if this is, you know, semantic dementia patients are starting to try and pull on any form of detail that they can, from episodic, from semantic. And that's why we're seeing that these more parietal regions are starting to become important for this type of future simulation. Obviously, that's very speculative, and I'd be really happy to get anyone else's opinion on that in the question section. So another interesting angle to then explore in the context of these patients is what happens if you remove the temporal constraints entirely, and if you just ask semantic dementia patients to construct atemporal scenes. And so we've been drawing heavily on the work of Demis Hassabis and Eleanor Maguire and looking to see how do patients with semantic dementia fare on a standard scene construction task. And so this is also, again, sort of resonating with this idea of trying to move away from the patients relying on past experiences. So many of these scenes, so there's a beach, a castle, a forest, they're all very commonplace, very familiar, probably very amenable to rolling out a sort of semanticized account. And so I had initially approached this study as expecting really significant impairments in the semantic dementia patients. This study is a case study where we had a very, very circumscribed case with very pure semantic deficits and a lateralized to the left anterior temporal lobe and hippocampal atrophy. And so I asked this patient GC to construct these scenes on the scene construction task. And I really was blown away by his descriptions. So he provided these extremely evocative and perceptually rich, you know, descriptions of the various contexts that were imbued with all of these lovely details. Like he's talking about how the light would filter through the water, the color of the water, the depth. It's a very cohesive and contextually rich scene. And GC self-rated, you know, in terms of phenomenology, that it was vivid. He felt it was fairly detailed. He felt a feeling of presence, and his ratings on the spatial coherence index indicated that the scene was cohesive and it was integrated. This is GC. He's the little red square here. So he's sitting very comfortably relative to an age matched control group in terms of the details that he generated, the spatial coherence index on the task, and also the overall experiential index. So this, you know, from the face value would suggest that scene construction is intact in semantic dementia. But we were also interested, so I presented this work at UCL, and Eleanor Maguire asked, did we have any of the other patients who show right lateralized atrophy? And we actually had tested someone fortuitously who did have this profile of atrophy. So here you can see patient GC is showing very nice sort of circumscribed hippocampal and some anterior temporal atrophy. And patient DF, who is one of these very rare cases of right lateralized semantic dementia, is showing the sort of converse profile, so right lateralized hippocampal atrophy. So we ran the scene construction task, we had a look, and what's interesting is, so we've seen patient GC is doing very well on this task. He's describing scenes that are sort of lovely panoramas, they're very detailed, they're very vivid. As a reader, you feel you can picture the scene quite well. The patient DF, I don't know if you can see here, he scored almost at floor on this task. And it was so interesting to look at his description. So he was actually focusing in on the most microscopic portions of the scene. So there actually wasn't a scene. He was describing instead the sort of texture of the grain of sand on the beach in the absence of the beach scene. So there's something about the scale here, and maybe something to do with left and right hippocampal contributions to how we actually build scenes. And whereas the perceptual details seem to be still amenable to patient DF, he just wasn't able to construct an integrated scene. But one of the big sort of issues for me is that even though patient GC, so this is our case who did remarkably well on the task, he was definitely defaulting to prior episodic experiences. So there were a few scenes on the task where GC had not experienced, you know, the castle scene, and then the scene construction sort of fell asunder. So taking that idea further, I really wanted to explore how the plausibility or the sort of familiarity of the context might influence the capacity for scene construction in semantic dementia. And so we wanted to pick a context that people with this condition would understand and have some rudimentary knowledge of, but that they shouldn't have any episodic experience of. So we asked them to simulate or to imagine spending a day on the moon. And so we had to check prior, so this was all conducted prior to the 50th anniversary of the moon landings, thankfully. And we also checked that people had not been watching, you know, documentaries. It was before the Ryan Gosling First Man, all of this. So we didn't want any episodic contamination. That said, there probably is some, but we tried to minimize it as much as we can. And what I think is really interesting is that the semantic dementia group just score absolutely almost at floor on this task. So many of the participants were quite perplexed and almost a little bit upset at being asked to push, you know, to consider even doing this, because it was so beyond their idea of what is possible that they would kept saying, this wouldn't happen, this is not possible, I wouldn't ever go there. And then we'd keep trying to push them. But it's like the semantic, the absence of that framework rendered them very concrete. So it was very difficult for some of our patients, particularly in the more advanced stages, to actually generate and even consider putting themselves into that context. And so when we looked again using BBM this time, we controlled for event simulation on a plausible condition. So we wanted to sort of isolate out, you know, what's sort of unique to this novel event simulation. And now we're finding ventromedial prefrontal cortex comes out, which I think is really nice, because it's sort of, if we're doing a bit of a reverse inference, it puts me in mind of schemas, and that the ventromedial PFC is an important region for us to be able to deploy schemas and to consider what normally happens in particular contexts. So I think there's something about this breakdown between the medial temporal lobes and the ventromedial PFC in semantic dementia that renders them again incapable of being able to, you know, put themselves into that implausible context. The context just simply isn't there for them because that scaffold or that schema has been eroded. And again, I always think the transcripts are really important for us to look at in these different scenarios. This is a control participant who's describing, you know, the landscape, the dust, it's bumpy, it's rocky, they're bouncing along, you know, the lack of gravity, the eerie light, and just how emotional this would be for them. So many of the controls really tapped into that evocative feeling of being on the moon and found it quite, you know, an exhilarating experience. But then we have a semantic dementia patient who says, I'm not sure what you'd be doing. I don't think you'd be doing a lot. You'd be looking back to Earth. It would be unusual. So they understand the construct. And then they just say, it's probably something you talk about when you get home. We see it all the time. It's a long way away though. And then they just say, I honestly don't know because I've never been there. It's like, I don't have an episodic memory, you know, to compensate. And so I can't give you any more than this. So they had exhausted their sort of conceptual knowledge of moon. And that was where the simulation ended. And this is just a very brief snippet, if we have time, about just thinking about the fact that all of these tasks so far that I've described have been asking our participants to deliberately or engage in this sort of intentional retrieval or intentional future simulation. But we've also been using our shapes expectations task, which sort of instantiates boredom and is really conducive to mind wandering in the laboratory setting. And so participants are just presented with a number of very simple geometric shapes, and it's so boring. They're presented on the screen for a number of different time periods, and you cannot help but lapse and let your mind wander. So we've shown in other patient populations that in behavioral variant FTD, for example, patients become very stimulus bound. And we've shown different profiles of spontaneous cognition in older versus younger adults. So this is preliminary data looking at spontaneous cognition, so unintentional sort of mind wandering in semantic dementia. And so I'm just going to draw your attention to two of the levels that we can extract from the task. So level 2 is where participants would just comment predominantly on the semantic attributes of the shape in front of them. So they might say, oh, it's a blue, it's square, it's got straight lines. So very, blue is my favorite color, this kind of thing. Then level 4 is fully fledged sort of spontaneous thoughts that are completely divorced from the stimuli at hand. So they're perceptually decoupled, and the person has sort of broken free from the immediate stimulus and has mind wandered. And we found that when we control for the overall level of cognitive impairment in our semantic dementia patients, they're actually generating far more fully fledged sort of mind wandering instances relative to age matched controls. So we can't then say that they're that patients with dementia don't have a rich internal experience, because there's clearly they are thinking about things as they're being left to their own devices. And we've gone to the transcripts to try and understand some of the content about what they might be thinking of in these passive states. And invariably, it seems that many of these thoughts that are, flying through, as they're completing this sort of very monotonous task, are personally relevant and autobiographical experiences. So people were talking about thinking of school, thinking of old friends. One person mentioned an episodic recent experience because the area they're in is currently experiencing drought and they were hoping they would get more rain. And then this is like an example of the level 2 absence of semantic information. So the person was perplexed because they were trying to think of the name of the shape, but they couldn't remember it, because obviously that is a semantic fact. So I think I'm leaning towards that we really need to move towards a more sort of integrative, maybe continuum of episodic and semantic interactions when we're thinking about more complex constructs like autobiographical memory or episodic future thinking. And so I propose that there is a continuum where we're sort of dancing along in between perceptual and conceptual contributions, and that the loading or the pendulum will swing, and it can depend on mood, on your alertness, on the nature of the task, on context, as well as the integrity of your underlying episodic and semantic systems. And so in a population such as semantic dementia, then we shouldn't be surprised that there is this leaning more towards the perceptual or the episodic space or state, because their conceptual knowledge is so degraded. And so we recently put forward this piece, myself and Louis Renaud, Mars Moscovich and Mick Rugg, where we tried to sort of integrate more of the recent advances in the neuroimaging space with some of the clinical literature, and think about how we could update some of the ideas originally proposed by Tulving, and think about more of a sort of this episodic semantic overlap or interplay. And so if anyone is interested, that is a paper I would recommend. So I think hopefully I have convinced you of the role and the importance of semantic and conceptual contributions to event construction. We're going to keep exploring, how these various temporal, distance, and event novelty in particular might be compromised by, different episodic or semantic impairments, and hopefully sort of bridge the gap a bit between, considering episodic and semantic memory as completely, mutually exclusive categories towards a more integrative framework. So just to thank the very amazing team at Frontier and all of our participants and their family members who really generously contribute their time to take part in our research, as well as my funding buddies and my fantastic Mind team, who are an incredible group of people that really help so much. And thank you again for inviting me, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think we have like one or like two questions. If anyone has any questions? Simon?
Sorry, am I?
Yeah.
I'm on? Yeah. So very, very interesting. Thank you for that. So I'm trying to, I don't really have a properly formulated question. So, but it takes me back to some of the earlier memory modeling work where, well, in fact, the whole memory modeling domain, I guess, has tended to see the episodic-semantic division as more of a kind of epiphenomena as opposed to something, you know, that we would necessarily reify. And so I'm thinking specifically back to the Humphreys, Bain and Pike model, where the idea is that, you know, semantic memory is essentially the episodic memory where you don't have a very strong contextual cue, essentially. And so I'm just wondering, and I guess I'm trying to fit what you've just said into this framework if I can. I'm not sure I can, but have you thought about, you know, to what extent, if it was really this just degradation of the contextual cue, what kind of work could that do in trying to explain the results?
So there's a lot going on in that question. So do you mean in terms of the semantic dementia patients, or are you talking about the semantic contributions to these processes in general?
Well, I guess both. So there's what do I want to say here? So is there a way to construe? Let's take a specific example. So I have to admit, I wasn't so surprised by say the near future kind of result, because I would have said, oh, well, you can't have an episodic memory of something that hasn't happened yet, right? And so I guess for me there, the more interesting thing was that the semantic dementia patients fell off quite dramatically with the far distant past results, right, relative to controls. So let's take that kind of example. So I could certainly imagine how you know, the first bit, the difficulty going forward, could be compromised. But I guess I'm struggling to figure out how you would fit the second bit in.
Yeah, so I think that it's interesting what, you know, from different fields, what you're finding interesting versus what we were finding interesting, because the remote memory effects that we see in semantic dementia, they've been documented for many, many years. So some of the earliest studies back in the 90s, even by John Hodges and Kim Graham, showed this sort of step phenomenon where recent is intact, but older memories are far more degraded. And so the explanation for that was that as time goes by, the further into the past you go, these memories have become almost archived, you know, it's kind of in line with standard consolidation theory, or that they're just no longer episodic anymore, and that it's just the shell or the conceptual, like overgeneral sort of like general script, or the overgeneral sort of just idea of what happened is preserved in the absence of, you know, episodic re-experiencing and pulling all those details together to make this evocative, you know, spatially, temporally cohesive kind of event. So the fact that the semantic dementia patients are showing remote memory impairment would resonate with that set of kind of ideas. I'm not sure how that falls in line with some of the models that you've mentioned, though, because we've only started to come at the computational side more recently. We were sort of being informed more by the neuropsychological literature and the clinical literature, which tends to treat these as very dissociable constructs.
Yeah. Right. Anyway, I'll let someone else have a turn.
We're a little bit over time, but if anybody has like a really short question, I'll make one short question.
I have a quick short question, if that's, this kind of, your conclusions seem consistent with the idea that the memory system is generalizing during retrieval and filling in details during retrieval. So on that point, would you, with somewhere like the semantic poles, for example, would they be, would they encode, what kind of representation do you suppose, do you think that they encode exactly? Is it, or is it more of a processor where they do the abstraction and presumably with the driver from the ventromedial PFC or something like that?
Yeah, again, like that's a great question, and it's one I'm still not clear on what the ATLs are doing, and there's a huge debate about whether it's, you know, this hub or whether there are like domain specific or domain general sort of processes going on there. I feel that the gradient approach is probably most promising, and that it's all relative, and so that there's information from the VMPFC, like schematic information, there's abstract conceptual knowledge being sort of integrated possibly in the ATLs, and that there's perceptual information being pulled from sensory cortices. The hippocampus is trying to combine and create these sort of novel spatial frameworks. But I think as well, we're still missing a puzzle with the angular gyres, because that is a zone of integration, and I'm trying to work out where, like, or sort of when in the process this structure comes into it, because I think it does play a key role, and we can't just focus on the anterior portion of the core memory network. We have to also integrate in the posterior contributions. I don't think I've answered your question, but I agree.
Cool. Thank you. No, that kind of will get me thinking a bit more, but yeah, thanks a lot for your talk. Really cool stuff.
Okay, thank you very much again for the wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I learned a lot. So